Good afternoon. Thank you for attending the last session of today. There are a lot of fantastic presentations today, so a lot of hard acts to follow. I hope you've all had a fantastic day too. Everybody? Energy at the end of the day? Nobody? Fantastic. Great. So I think Chris gave most of my presentation there, so I can cut out the first half of it, but I still have 3 more hours of material to pack in, so I hope you all settled in. If you've locked the doors at the back so they can't leave, fantastic. So as Chris mentioned, I'm going to talk about the ever-changing landscape. So you're probably looking at me and saying, who's this guy to talk about trends? What does he know about trends? Well, my background, for 12 years I spent time at some large consulting companies looking at trends, looking at numbers, and looking at tons of Excel sheets, trying to make sense of them and pulling them together into some hopefully interesting graphs to make sense of them. I spent a lot of time, here's an early picture of me just looking, staring, trying to find the trends, and that's when I had spiky hair before. Then I joined Electronic Arts. So about the presentation itself, so as Chris mentioned, I collected data from over 100 companies since the year 2011. We asked questions such as, what are the costs of your services? What types of services are you providing? Where are your client locations? And what are their lines of business? What is the project management software you're using? What are the art and animation software packages you're using? And what's the employee breakdown? How many art directors do you have, project managers, and technical directors? This information was then compiled into a series of reports. These reports were shared with everybody that took part in the survey. So as you can see, a lot of information on rates by country and rates by, for each type of art, cinematics, props, environments, etc. So it's the last session of today. I've got lots of data in Excel. I could show the Excel data and you'll be all, kind of feeling lagged, kind of falling asleep. A little bit like this.
In an effort to alleviate the effects of the
this could be me just walking through the data,
past,
and you would be all like this. And that's not what I want today. So I want to take an entertaining look at the trends that we're seeing today. So some of the ground rules, some of the things that I won't cover. Hopefully all of you attended the fantastic presentation this morning by Brian Nider. And he covered some of the big trends in the industry and how they're affecting external development. Things like the growing video games industry, proliferation of devices, increasing accessibility to games, the move to digital by a lot of big publishers, more content needed for all of these games and these bigger games, and growth in emerging markets. So hopefully you saw the presentation today, and I'm not going to cover these things in this presentation on trends. Also, I made up a word here. I've submitted it to the Queen, and hopefully she'll accept it for the Oxford English Dictionary. I'm going to be a presentologist. I'm not going to be a futurologist. I'm going to talk about today and the things that are happening today. The reason being is a group of urban planners got together in 1955 and tried to predict the future. What did they predict? That everybody would be flying around in helicopters by the 1990s. I don't personally want to be used as an example of a really bad prediction for the future. So that's why I'm going to be a presentologist. So I'm going to focus on some big trends. There's a lot of data, a lot of information. I've tried to extrapolate those trends, and for the last session of today, tried to make it entertaining. So how do I categorize trends? At a high level, I like to categorize them in 2 different ways. The first are ninja trends, those that lurk in the background, they lurk in the dark and they surprise you, they jump out when you don't expect them and they affect your business. The second type of trends are T-Rex trends. You can see them from a long way away, you can hear them, you can see them, the ground is rumbling as they start to approach. You can prepare for those. So what I'm going to cover in this presentation are the ninja trends. Now, some of these ninja trends, for some of you in some countries, may be T-Rex trends. But from others outside of that country, I think there'll be ninja trends. So the first trend I like to call global levelization, another word that I've made up once again, which hopefully they'll accept into the Oxford English Dictionary. So what is global levelization? What's he talking about? This is looking at the data. What I'm seeing is a lot of prices in traditionally low-cost markets are starting to increase. And the prices in some of the traditionally high-cost markets, increase, and the prices in the traditionally high-cost markets are starting to decrease. So to look at this trend, let's jump up to the 10,000-foot level and look at some of the macro factors and some of the climates. So in a recent survey by Mercer Consulting for 2013, they found that Beijing and Shanghai are more expensive than London and New York. Shanghai was ranked as the 16th most expensive city in the world. Beijing 17th, London down at 25th, and New York at 32nd. Costs of living are increasing in some of these cities in traditionally low-cost markets. Also, if we jump across to see the cost of living, in Shanghai, you can see it's the most expensive place on this list, more expensive than London and Vancouver to buy your milk, and very expensive, a lot more than London, to buy your bread. And also in Taipei, you don't want to take tomatoes along to heckle a comedy act or a theatrical performance you don't enjoy, because it's very expensive to throw tomatoes at $3.54 per kilogram. Now let's jump across from the cost of living and look at wages in these markets. Wages are also starting to increase. As you can see, there's data here since 2009 on the wage inflation in different markets. You can see that in China, the rates have increased there've been about 9% increase in wages per year. In India, we're seeing 10 to 12% wage increases per year. And over here, Malaysia and Philippines, you can also see that the rates are increasing. Whereas in the traditionally high-cost markets, examples here of Canada, the UK and US, for the last 3 years, wage inflation has only been around 3%. So combining these together, you can see that costs are increasing, wages are increasing very quickly in traditionally low-cost markets, and so is the cost of living. So you're probably thinking now, how does this apply to the games industry? Where is all this magic data coming in? So let's dive down to deeper level and look at some of the art rate increases that we found by looking at the survey results. So in China, we saw that concept art, since 2011, increased 24%. And this is from the respondents over 100 companies. 2D casual art also saw a 20% increase. 3D props, 11%. And VFX, 8%. Now let's jump from China across to India, another huge outsourcing market. If we look at 3D characters, we saw an increase of 28% since the previous year. 46%, an astounding 46% of 2D casual art, and I'll touch on this a little bit later. 3D props, 28%, and 3D vehicles, an astounding 43%. Huge increases we're seeing in India. Then we jump across to Europe, as an example here, in Hungary. 18% in characters, 18% in 3D props, and 13% in 3D animation. So we can see India, China, Hungary, 3 big markets for external development. We're seeing rapid wage increases. So we're talking about global levelization. That shows some of the rates increasing in some of the traditionally low-cost markets. So where are they decreasing? Let's take a look at North America and some of the things that are happening for rates to become more competitive. So a lot of companies, quite a number of companies in the Canada and US are pursuing tax breaks. Some regions give tax breaks of 30 to 35%. They can then pass those cost savings on to the clients. So their rates are decreasing with these tax breaks. Also, some teams are augmenting their high-cost team with teams in low-cost markets, so they share the work and then can reduce the rates. But what about Western Europe, you're probably asking? Well, Western Europe at the moment, we're not seeing the rates decrease. They're remaining very high. In the UK, the rates are remaining very high. And in even Central Europe, in Austria, the rates are remaining incredibly high. So there's not really any tax incentives at the moment in the UK, so they can't reduce their rates. However, organizations such as TIGA are lobbying the government. They've been lobbying the government for 5.5 years in the UK to try and get tax breaks for game development companies. The effect so far of not having the tax breaks is the number of people in the games industry in the UK has dropped 41% since 2009 because it's so expensive to work with UK companies. The results of the survey actually showed that for UK companies, more of their clients are coming from the UK. On average, 60% of their clients now are from the UK, which is up from around 30-something% the previous year. That shows that they're being used because proximity is important. Same with Austria. What we're seeing there is most of their clients are from inside Austria, where proximity and sometimes language is very important. So some things to contemplate. Put your hand up in the room if you're from an external development company and from publishers and developers. Okay, so a good mix. So some things to contemplate for external development companies. Are you creating a clear value proposition for when rate differences against competitors aren't minimal? For those in low-cost markets, when you're going up against companies in high-cost markets, are you differentiating the value and what you can bring to the table, and vice versa sometimes? Are you taking advantage of tier 3 cities in your country? And for developers and publishers, if cost savings are key, are you keeping a balanced country portfolio? Are you looking at some of the other markets, such as Indonesia and Thailand, and Malaysia, where rates are still quite low because they haven't seen those huge wage inflations and huge increase in the cost of living in some of those? And are you helping your external partners achieve production efficiencies? Very, very key, and something that was covered in the previous talk. So are you working with them to make sure that the cost of the assets is decreasing by helping them attain those efficiencies? So the next one I'd like to go on to, I like to call the Darwinian Effect. What is the Darwinian Effect? What is he talking about? This doesn't really say much. The market changes are having a range of Darwinian-like effects on external development companies. What does this mean? Let's take the case of the Dodo to begin with. Who knows about the Dodo? So the Dodo was a flightless animal that lived on the island of Mauritius. It had an abundance of food. It ate nuts and leaves and berries. It laid its eggs on the ground because it had no predators. It was perfectly set up for the current climate in Mauritius. It had abundance of food, lay its eggs on the ground, no predators. Then things changed. The Dutch came along on the way to Indonesia. They brought rats and dogs and pigs. They came onto the island, and the Dodo wasn't scared of them. It became the perfect food source, its eggs and the bird itself for the Dutch, and the animals that they brought along. So what happened to the Dodo, unfortunately, is it became extinct. Are there? No pity for the Dodo. So it's happening to some external development companies too. We're seeing a number of companies, and a huge increase since the last year in the number of companies that are going extinct. They're not investing in the right technologies. They're not keeping on top of market trends. They're not investing in the talent. They're not investing in making sure they get competitive rates, and they're falling by the wayside and going extinct. The second set classification of companies I like to call, well, we're going to talk about the antelope. So the evolution of the antelope. The antelope used to wander through the meadows, eating all of the leaves that were on the level, about eye level, and it was happy it had an abundance of food. But then the leaves started to secrete a toxin, which poisoned the antelope. So the antelope adapted. It gained an immunity to the poison that was secreted. So the bush adapted, and it started to grow the leaves up high on the tree. So the antelope adapted again, and it grew a long tongue and a long neck over time so that it could continue to eat. So this is similar to a lot of external development companies that we're seeing. A lot are adapting with market changes. They continually change in terms of their offerings. They offer different services. They add to their services. They change the mix. Maybe they started offering 3D services, and with the increase in mobile games, they moved to 2D. Or they started to adapt and add some type of engineering offering. So these companies are adapting with the market. They're keeping on top of market trends. Third, I'd like to talk about the Gator. So the gator hasn't changed at all in its body shape in 200 million years. It's thrived without any issues. And there's a lot of companies that we see as well that are thriving. They're not really changing. They've invested in the processes. They've invested in efficiencies. They've invested in the talent. So they could just continue to operate and continue to thrive. However, things can change. And someone who's a company that's an Antelope could easily become a Dodo. And one day, if they don't keep on top of market trends, then the Gators could also become Dodos. So things to contemplate. What category, if you're from a vendor, do you fall in? Are you monitoring this to make sure that you're adapting with market changes? Are you monitoring these trends? Are you aware of the potential ninja trends, the underlying trends that could jump out and affect your core business quickly and overnight and put you out of business? Developers, are you assessing your partners? Are you helping them assess themselves to make sure they're set up to support you in the future? And are you keeping your partners up to date with your future needs so they can adapt as needed? The third trend I like to call mitosis mania, or cell division. So this is something else that I saw from the data. A number of companies are starting to divide. So previously, we saw a lot of entities out there that were around for a long time, but they're starting to divide now in two different ways. A lot of people are leaving some of these companies as they grow, and they're setting up their own competing businesses. We're seeing this in a lot of markets, and especially from the data with the abundance of new companies that are out there. And secondly, companies are starting to divide internally. We've seen a sudden increase in 2013 in the number of companies that are setting up mobile divisions. They have their core business, and then they set up a mobile division under a different brand, sold separately, its own website, which they go to market to, either in developing their own IP or creating mobile games for clients. So, some things for you to contemplate here. How can you keep key staff members so they don't leave and set up competing businesses? Are you identifying those that are at risk of leaving and the high quality talent that you can't lose? How do you stop the domino effect of once one person leaves, that an entire team leaves? And going over to the publisher's side, do you have strategies if this happens? If one day you come in and you hear that 20 people, your core team, have all moved and set up another company, what's your strategy for dealing with this? Something we've faced a number of times and something that's very important. Now on to the fourth trend, I like to call the Pacman Effect. What is the Pacman Effect? Companies are continuing to pursue acquisition strategies. It's not something new that's in 2013, it's a continuance. So why are companies pursuing acquisition strategies? Firstly, traditional IT outsourcing companies are pursuing these acquisition strategies. As Brian mentioned in his talk this morning, the video games industry is now as big as the films industry, or bigger. And there's a lot of press around this. A lot of people are hearing about it. These companies that never looked at the games industry before, these big IT outsourcing companies, are now saying, you know what, we want a piece of that pie. Can we have some, please? How do we get in? Easiest way to do that, acquire a company, acquire the clients, acquire the talent, so that you can quickly move into this industry. An example of this that's out there publicly is Globant, who acquired Nextiv. They wanted to grow the mobile talent, so they acquired a mobile company to bring that with experience in mobile games. So they quickly had that talent and expertise. Game developers and publishers are also acquiring some of their outsourcing partners, and we've seen an increase in this too. Sometimes they want to reach out and have a low-cost center somewhere. What's the quickest way of doing that? Just buy a company, a lot quicker than identifying a location, setting up the facilities, and recruiting all the talent. A publicly announced example of this is when WarGamingNet acquired Nikitova in the Ukraine. They liked the talent and they wanted them to work on their new MMO. Third group of companies that we're seeing doing this are game arts and software engineering external development vendors. There's a number of examples where teams want to branch out into another country. they want to lower their costs by not only having a location in China, but maybe in India or somewhere in Europe, to diversify, to be nearer to the clients or to lower the costs. And lastly, film and animation companies. We've seen a number of film and animation companies looking to or acquiring companies or outsourcing vendors that are working with the games industry, because sometimes they can leverage the same talent. Another way for them quickly to get a low-cost center to work on their films and their movies, because they're facing the same problems with costs continuing to increase. So some things to contemplate. Are you keeping an eye on the market and who is being acquired? Do you have a risk mitigation strategy if your vendor is acquired? Are you planning ahead? So, to round things up, some additional observations. I'm not going to apply any nutty names to these ones. So something I covered earlier, casual 2D art costs are increasing in major external development low-cost locations. When we looked at the data, we saw that in China, casual art rate increases have been 20%. In India, they've been 46%, and in Ukraine, 4%. We've seen previously there were a lot of companies focusing on 2D art and offering very low rates. It wasn't sexy before. With the increase in mobile and number of people playing mobile games, it's become sexier, and there's been more demands on the quality, and especially when you're working with certain IP on these artists. Secondly, we've seen since last year, the data shows a lot more companies establishing Western entities. We're seeing companies establishing entities in the US, in the UK, in Germany, in Switzerland, and a number of different countries. For a number of reasons. They want to establish a local presence. They want to be close to the client. They want to have key people on the biz dev or project management side close to the clients. Secondly, they're preparing for IPO, and it's a lot easier if they have an entity in the UK or US or one of these markets. Thirdly, to mitigate translation risk. So if you read recently about the rupee in India, it's going up and down against the dollar. Also in China, have had the similar issues. And a lot of emerging markets, when they're paid in dollars, it's not worth as much when they translate that into local currency. So sometimes it's just easier to hold those accounts in a more stable currency where the rates aren't increasing or going up and down all the time. Lastly is for tax purposes. Self-explanatory. So next, this is an interesting one. So I asked everybody that participated in the survey where their clients are from. And recently we've been contacted quite a bit with a number of companies from Korea, Japan, and China who have traditionally just served the local market and who are wanting to break out and work with North American companies. So I thought the data would say there's been a huge increase in companies from China and from Korea and some of the other countries from the US. But the data didn't show that actually. It showed a huge increase in the number of clients from Japan and Russia since last year. So looking at some of the data, Chinese companies have seen an increase from 6% of their clients being from Japan to 20%. India companies have seen an increase on average from 1 to 8%. And UK companies have seen an increase from 3 to 15% of their clients coming from Japan. Jump over to Russia, and Chinese companies have seen an increase from 0 to 7% of their clients coming from Russia. So big sudden increases, unexpected increases, kind of that ninja unexpected from Russia and from Japan. The last trend, dedicated team creation. So there's been an increase in the number of dedicated teams formed or captive centers at outsourcing providers. We've seen a number of big publishers, developers wanting to lock in talent. An example here of one that was publicly announced. But they do this by setting up a captive center or dedicated team. They secure their resources for a long period of time, and they almost just become an extension in a separate area of the developer or publisher. So we've seen a lot of movement in this area. This is something that's been going on for a very long time with traditional IT outsourcing companies, and something we're seeing entering the games market too. So, just to recap, we talked about global levelization, we talked about the Darwinian effect, we talked about cell division, and we looked at some additional observations. And I missed Pacman, we talked about him too. So, all of you that purchased the Premier Pass, and anybody that participated in the survey, will receive all of the data behind this, as in the reports I showed earlier. And I encourage you all to look through the data yourself and try and identify your own trends. But just one word of warning, in my previous company, I tried to look at the data, and this is what happened to me.
Guys, just thought you might want to know, sales aren't up, they're down. Yes, sir.
So be careful how you look at the data. You may want to talk to other peers in the industry.